Hey, this is Patrick Rady, and I'll be your host for your Basketball and Bourbon podcast. For the next hour, we'll share stories involving two of my greatest passions, basketball and bourbon. Sit back and enjoy stories shared from people who have good old-fashioned experiences from the hardwood and the barrel. As we like to say on the show here, cheers to the round ball and the barrel. Welcome, everyone, and today, episode 4 of the Basketball and Bourbon podcast, I'd like to welcome author Nick Greene. Nick is the author of How to Watch Basketball Like a Genius, What Game Designers, Economists, Ballet Choreographers, and Theoretical Astrophysicists Reveal About the Greatest Game on Earth. Nick, welcome to the podcast, and to start off, what inspired you to write the book?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Inspiration for the book was pretty simple in the broad sense. I just sort of love talking to people about basketball. And it's something I kind of find myself getting in chats with about, even if that wasn't the original intention. I think part of it may be I'm currently living in the Bay Area, and the sustained success of the Golden State Warriors means that everyone's a little bit of a fan. And in sort of conversations that have started with interesting people that might have been for a different kind of story I was writing, or just a friendly conversation, have sort of kind of segued into basketball. And the book was sort of a formal continuation of that idea. The idea being that people have interesting things to say about the game and interesting perspectives on it, even if they might not consider themselves experts to it.
And that's what's the fun about basketball. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to start this podcast. And as a former coach, I didn't want to just interview coaches. I wanted to interview fans. We've had an official on here. We've had a broadcaster. So we want to get it kind of like what you did in writing this book, try to get a variety of people and what they remember about some of the greatest games that they've watched. In the book, you go back and you talk about James Naismith. Now, my father has coached basketball for 51 years, or he did coach basketball for 51 years. So from age 2 or 3, I was always in a gym. And I knew who James Naismith was. I knew he invented the game. But you were able to research and find there's a little character to James Naismith that I think people maybe don't understand. And from your research, could you share the mindset that Naismith had about basketball?
Yeah, he's a fascinating guy. And one thing about basketball that I think is so interesting, is it's the only major sport that we could trace to one single inventor. Football evolved from rugby, which evolved from this and that, and baseball from cricket, from this, but basketball, we can find the first day of the first game, who invented it and why. And so Naismith, he wasn't setting out to change the world or invent one of the second biggest sport in the world that would eventually become that. He basically was a teacher at the YMCA in Springfield, Massachusetts, and was tasked with um, teaching a class of very rowdy and disobedient young men. They were dubbed the incorrigibles. There was a pretty brutal snowstorm, and he basically said, I got to figure out a way to get these guys to let off some steam and some energy without killing each other. He tried, various things like indoor versions of football and even soccer, and it just all became too rambunctious, too dangerous, especially with the indoor component. And so he sat down and said, I got to invent a fun, compelling game for the indoors. And basketball, through a couple, you know, uh, trial and errors of his own invention, sort of came to be. And it didn't look much like the basketball as we know it. For example, you weren't allowed to move with the ball at the time. That was a very important rule. Is rule to protect his students from each other, because he just saw them colliding into each other like crazy. So things obviously over time evolved and changed, but basketball, as a sport, happened because of one desperate teacher.
That's great. And as a teacher, and I have teacher friends and other teachers that will be listening to this podcast, they can relate to probably the, what do they call it, the corrigibles.
Yeah, the incorrigibles. Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. So in education, we've all been there, right? And you're looking at something that can just keep them occupied and keep their interest. So I want to stay on that. So I was a coach for 34 years. And one of the big, win games, win championships. That's always at the forefront. Now, there's other byproducts. Definitely, you want your athletes to be good students, role models for other kids. Yeah, but at the end of the day, you were there to win. And that wasn't necessarily Naismith's goal with basketball, was it?
Far from it. He didn't care at all about winning or losing. You got to remember he was also a Presbyterian minister, and his main motivations were, get these guys on the right track, keep them engaged, the spirit of the game, sportsmanship, that kind of thing. And he actually, I mean, he didn't even think that coaches should be a thing. Nevertheless, he was tasked with coaching the University of Kansas's basketball team, and is the only coach in the school's history to have a losing record. Yeah, he couldn't give two you know whats about winning and losing, which was definitely, I think, part of his charm. And in a weird way, I think also a key to basketball's greater success, in that he wasn't this competitive guy who wanted to claim all the credit. He was fine with people changing his game. He was fine with not making money off of it. He was just very kind of pure of heart and soul, it would seem.
Yeah, and as a lover of the game, I have thoroughly enjoyed that chapter, just learning a little bit more about James Naismith. And another guy, if you coached, if you played, at some point you did the Mikan drill. And, I don't know if you're the right-handed hook and the left-handed hook, and inside foot, inside foot. It was a great way to teach young kids layups. Well, reading your book, I didn't realize George Mikan may have had the most, I should say, the biggest effect on changes of the game, from the shot clock to goaltending to the 3-second lane and those things. Tell our audience a little bit about Big George.
Yeah, well, he was, so dominant. Different rules sprout up basically to slow him down. As you mentioned, goaltending, 3-second violation. I mean, he was so much bigger and more spry and athletic than everyone, that he could basically, have sort of a superhuman influence on the game. And then, ironically, I don't know if this is irony, but it's maybe coincidentally or interestingly, he became the commissioner of the ABA, the competitor league to the NBA, and in a sort of bid to give his league a leg up and make it a little more interesting than the massive competitors, is he helped institute the 3-point line, which, I guess, here's where the irony could come in, is the single invention that eventually sort of took away the big man's dominance more than all others. But yeah, George Mikan has his fingerprints all over the game, be it as a athlete or a executive.
In the book, it's interesting. I'm a Pacers fan, and I know you grew up in Chicago. You're a Bulls fan, so you guys broke our heart in the late '90s there, when we thought we had you at Chicago, and then that fourth quarter happened.
That team broke a lot of hearts.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. So you talked about Roy Hibbert actually being one of those, basically, that was extinct. And I mean, I still remember 2014, that block on Carmelo Anthony. I don't know if you remember.
Of course.
But as Pacer fans, we hated the Knicks. So
No, of course.
taking back to the early Reggie stuff.
Yep.
But yeah, you talk about how that the 3-point line kind of, there's a guy that Roy Hibbert was, what is it, 2-time All-Star?
Yeah, but I forget exactly how. I mean, but he signed a huge contract. He was one of the most influential players in the entire game, and then kind of got to the point where, okay, if he can't really stretch the floor at all, he's going to be kind of doesn't really have a place in the modern NBA. And so he goes from, he didn't get injured, he didn't slow down considerably. The game just changed around him, and he sort of had to leave the league much earlier than I think he or anyone would have expected when he first joined. And it's something you see now. I mean, look at the centers around the league. Um, you have some guys who will specialize in defense, but you got to be able to stretch the floor, or at least make up for it in other ways. And that's all because, again, the 3-point line.
Well, the Pacers are facing that again. What do we do with Miles Turner?
Yeah,
He's been listed, or talked about in a lot of trades, and
yeah.
I don't know. And now
He's an excellent passer, though.
he is an excellent passer, and I hope they keep him. He's really good in the community, and he really does a
Hmm.
lot with the fans. And I think that he and Sabonis kind of were back and forth a little bit. So I'm hoping that he has this breakout season. And yeah, just to get on a little Pacer talk there.
Yeah, and he could just be one of those guys who just happens to be. Yeah, no, he could just be one of those guys that happens to be brought up in trade discussions for the rest of his career,
Yeah,
and never moves when it
absolutely.
happens.
So let's talk a little bourbon. Do you have an everyday bourbon that you like?
Gosh, I don't. I wish I did. One bourbon that this is probably like a very pedestrian. I do like Bulleit's bourbon. Um, Otherwise, I love being gifted and suggested bourbons. My palate is not the most mature or advanced, but I do enjoy it a lot, and my education on it is pretty rudimentary. But yeah, I think my everyday bourbon would be whatever I have on hand.
I live in Indiana, coached in Indiana for 29 years at the high school level at either assistant JV or varsity coach. And there is one topic that will get people just in an uproar. It used to be class basketball, but now that's that ended in the late '90s, and so now we have a class system, so we no longer have the Hoosiers dream for everyone, but it's the shot clock. The shot clock seems to be, just the one thing that just gets people just crazy. And people that are for it will say they think it'll make the defenses better. It'll speed up the game, but I also think that the proponent or the people against it, they're talking about, well, it's going to take away some of the strategy. I'm not sure about that, but can we find people at the high school level to run the shot clock? All these things, and I think like I'm a believer that I think it's time. I think it's time the game evolves to that at all levels. But you did a little research on the history of the shot clock, and it kind of goes back to once again Mr. George Mikan and his game he played in with the Minneapolis Lakers and our state of Indiana, Fort Wayne Pistons, in a game that was 19-18. And really, that was the game that you say in your book kind of, eyebrows kind of raised a little bit all over the league. And one of those owners was Danny Bassone, I think, from the Syracuse National.
Yeah, Danny Biazzone. Yeah.
Piazzone. Okay. His quote, I think he says, the game is becoming a stalling game. And how did Biazzone eventually come up with
Hmm.
the 24-second shot clock?
Yeah, this is it's funny. This is very much a book about watching basketball, and I think the shot clock is an example of something, an invention and a change in the game that is made squarely for the viewer. That game, the Fort Wayne Minneapolis game, was widely considered to be the worst professional basketball game ever played. Just basically players, once they got a lead, dribbling around, dribbling around, dribbling around, didn't let anyone else touch the ball. And the NBA at the time was hemorrhaging attendance. No one was going to these games because they were boring. And Danny Biasone had a perspective. I think that was a little different because he never played. He never played the game his entire life. He owned bowling alleys. That was his day job. And he thought it was ridiculous to have to sit there and watch, people stalling. And so he invented, the idea of the shot clock came to him, and he came to 24 seconds because he looked at the box score of a game he thought was particularly entertaining and looked organically fluid. And he just did some basic division and said, okay, there is one shot every 24 seconds. That's how long the shot clock should be. And it's a number and a frame of time that's stuck. But the shot clock is very much a tool for the spectator, I'd say, rather than the player. Although, when you consider how widely implemented it is, it seems a little unfair to players who are raised without it, because they obviously are going to have a rude awakening when they get to a level where the shot clock does come into play. Um, so I couldn't imagine what that change would be like. It's kind of like going from black and white to color all of a sudden.
And I think as a coach, I think you're going to find out what coaches are really doing a good job of teaching skill work. Because when that shot clock comes down and they double, one of your players with the ball, and now there's a kid that you've told never to shoot it, is going to have to take that shot now, or it's going to be a turnover by the shot clock violation.
And Danny Biasone did a exhibition game with real pro players at the time, and he had to tell everyone to slow down because they were playing way too rushed. Because truth of the matter is 24 seconds is a pretty good amount of time. You have a lot of time to get things in order, work things out, go through a couple progressions, different plays. And so his advice to his players who are doing the exhibition was, don't just, relax. You have 24 seconds. That's plenty of time. And turned out to be true.
That method of going about that, and I think you talked about how he was intentional. Okay, this is a game that I liked, which means probably, and he really didn't have a basketball background, didn't I think you called him like a chain smoker little guy. Yeah.
Yep. Never played. Yeah, he's just sat on the sidelines smoking cigarette after cigarette.
I mean, he really didn't have anything from a, I guess, strategic point to say this, but he said, let's take the game that I thought was really good. So that means fans probably think that's really good, and then go about it that way. And I believe I read where you said the NCAA and that when they did their shot clock, they didn't really go about it that way.
I mean, they went to 35 seconds.
I think it was even 45 at the beginning.
Oh yeah, you're right. You're right. At that point, it was, you know, one of the major differences between the two. But yeah, Danny Biasone was he thought I want to be entertained. Everyone in the stands who actually pays money and how we get keep this league going wants to be entertained. So why not entertain them? And it was an instant success.
And I think as a coach, I've been guilty of this too. We fail to realize it is still an entertainment business, because at the end of the day, if you don't have the fans there, you don't have the money to provide to even for your team.
Yeah, at the pro level for sure. That's what it is. It's gotta be something that, and then, it's funny. Naismith, who had no designs about ever making money on his invention, even kicked out a guy who came to his office and suggested that he take a percentage of every ticket sold because he thought that was stupid. He said, "This is a game for everyone. It's not my game." But one of his tenets when he was sort of developing the game was it has to be pleasurable to watch. If it's going to be successful, it can't just be for the players. It has to be fun to watch for others too. And so, sort of the history of the game is this balance of the game itself, and then all these different rule changes and evolutions that are purely for the spectator.
Awesome stuff. Free throw shooting. I thought this was interesting. Big part of the game, but it's probably one of the topics where everybody thinks it's just so easy. I had to chuckle. And I had a little conversation with my dad the other night after I read this. From your research, the average free throw percentage for teams, players include, hasn't really changed much throughout the decades of the game.
It's shockingly consistent. It's been more or less the same since the dawn of the game, since it was, the lines were first put down the court. I wish I had a concrete reason for why that is, but it's the single most consistent aspect of the game, which is appropriate because it is the single most consistent aspect of the game. A free throw is always from the same distance, hoop's always the same height. It's the only time the game stops for everyone, just one person with the ball in the hoop, staring it down, and you can't really play defense. I know there's some people who say they can do psychological things, but in reality, it's the most consistent part of the game, and it's pretty wild that it's for every great free throw shooter we have someone who's bad enough to get the average to that same average that we've always seen.
And that's just incredible because I'm going to even go one further from your book between the men's and the women's game as well. And the women's game, the ball's a little bit smaller, so you would think there'd be, the obviously the hoop would be a little bit larger. You'd have room for more shots to go in, but that's not necessarily the case. The percentage stayed the same, right?
Percentages stay the same, and I spoke to these engineering professors at NC State who have done tons and tons of research on free throws. I mean, when I mean it, they've had in some of the most prestigious engineering journals in the world, they have published papers about free throws. And one of the things they found that actually the smaller ball, while it does kind of have more room to go through the hoop, the pressure, they're inflated to the same amount of pressure, so there's a little more bounce and it's a little less forgiving when it hits the rim. So through their studies and their research, they found that the women's ball, it's a little harder to make a free throw than the men's ball.
Wow. And that's the interesting stuff that I find. And like I said, this is what's been exciting about this journey, about starting this podcast, reading this book that you have written, is this game that I fell in love with as a young kid in Indiana, just the depths that it can go. And
It's got something for everyone.
it absolutely does. We're going to take a little break here. We're going to hear from our sponsor, Kentucky Peerless Distillery, and then when we come back, we're going to talk a little bourbon again.
The Peerless household offers an ambiance like no other. Our team is honored to share what makes the Kentucky Peerless Distilling Company so unique. Our urban distillery and vast family history are unmatched. After 5 generations of bourbon makers, we have the patience to make your favorite bourbon.
We are Kentucky Peerless Distilling Company, makers of fine bourbon and rye whiskey.
All right, so that voice you heard there was the owner, Corky Taylor, of Kentucky Peerless Distillery. They're a 4th generation distillery in the heart of Louisville, in the downtown, the urban district there. If you get a chance, go to the distillery. And if you happen to run into Corky, tell him Patrick in the Basketball and Bourbon podcast said to give it a try. And I'll tell you, it's one of the best bourbons that I have had, and I would definitely put that in my top 5. So another sponsor we have is the Rustic Barrel Company, and like them on Facebook at Rustic Barrel Company CO, or go to rusticbarrelco.com, and they are makers of fine bourbon craft. They make them right from the barrel, used barrels, and they'll make barrel heads. They'll make end tables, chairs. But give them a look here. Now we're going to go to the Rustic Barrel Bourbon starting 5 here. So Nick, if you had to put together a starting five of bourbons that you've had, and we can keep in mind that we can every team that we don't have all Jordan, LeBron, Kobe, and this is not an all dream team like with Pappy's and E.H. Taylor and all that. But you got to have a little, maybe a little Rodman in there. Your Chicago Bulls guy, and Johnny Paxson in there, or heck, I go back to Craig Hodges. But what would be your bourbon starting five? You did say Bullet. That's a solid kind of everyday guy that's going to show up, not cost you a whole lot on the salary cap, but it's going to give you a good flavor.
Yeah, gosh, you're putting me on the spot here, and I gotta say, my bourbon knowledge, it's not up to snuff. So, why don't you give me how about this? Give me a good analog of what those '90s Bulls teams. What would their bourbon five be?
All right, the bourbon five, and I would say Jordan would be Mr. Pappy Van Winkle, 20-year,
Okay.
definitely, and then Pippen, solid guy, never really probably got the credit that he deserved, but I would say Scotty. Versatile, you're right. Scotty's going to be William LaRue Weller, and that's a drink that it is outstanding, and so Scotty's going to be there. I'm going to say Dennis Rodman is Elijah Craig. Because Elijah Craig can go with anything. It's a solid price. If you want to put it in a mixer, that's great. If you want to have it over ice, that's great. If you want it neat, but Elijah Craig will never fail you. In the Heaven Hill Distillery, and then I'm going to go. With the Pax of the Cur there, I'm going to go Peerless. Peerless is that just smooth shooter, that guy that makes the clutch, shot, and then we'll see who am I leaving out here.
Give a Luke Longley.
Luke Longley. Okay, so Luke Longley, we got him there, and kind of a stretch guy, but kind of a glue. I'm going to go that Luke Longley would be. He's going to be Buffalo Trace, and Buffalo Trace kind of like Elijah Craig, in that $20-$30 range. We'll go there, and I'm going to say Phil Jackson is Michter's. Michter's is just a smooth drink, sophisticated, that kind of stuff, and so that's the Bulls, that epic Bulls team there. That's their bourbon starting five.
You just made my not even my starting five. You made my bourbon dynasty right there.
All right. So that was a great twist on this. Normally I ask the guest, and that was kind of fun. That was definitely fun. When you drink your bourbon, do you like it over ice? Do you like it neat, mixed? Or?
Yeah, usually over ice, just to keep it stretched out a little bit longer. But I don't like. I do like cocktails, but straight up or over ice, and usually with 1 or 2 cubes.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Get 1 or 2, so it doesn't dilute it too much.
Exactly.
I have gotten to the point. I've gotten to the point where I drink it neat, because when I put ice in it, I was drinking too much, too quick, and it was almost like
yeah. No, I can.
And then that was.
It gets a little too. It goes down a little too easy.
Goes down a little too easy, and so. That was a great little twist there. I like that. And I was a Bull. The Bulls were my second team. I was always a Pacer fan, and I love Jordan. And I wore 1988 to my high school prom. I wore the Jordans 3 to my prom.
All right. Nice.
Yeah. So I was definitely a Jordan guy, But I remember Reggie Miller calling out Pacer fans and said, why aren't you here to watch us? And I'm like, all right, this is Indiana. I like that spark out of Reggie, and Reggie was one of the few guys that actually didn't.
Reggie was, yeah, Reggie was terrifying. That quick release coming off screens. He was the one guy that when we played him, it was like, uh-oh, someone get a hand in his face. He drew blood.
And you talk about the ball being in the air in your book. When the ball was in the air, you were just, if you were in attendance, it was just like everybody rose. Like, they wanted, and we had an announcer, Slick Leonard. I don't know if you knew Slick, but he would always say, "Boom, baby!" That was it. And so it got to the point where the Pacer fans, when he would hit it, would chant, "Boom, baby!" on the threes. I can't even imagine if Clay and Steph played for the Pacers, how many boom babies it would be all night long.
No, but that's it was fascinating because Reggie really was that sort of glimpse into the future. At the time, it kind of felt like only Reggie can shoot like that, so it's only a Reggie thing. And little did we know there were kids in driveways around the country who were just working on that shot and grew up to be Steph and Clay, and now everyone's got or most people
Right.
got a
And,
pretty
you
sweet
talk
stroke.
about how much, and I would like to have seen how much Reggie would have had in this day and age where they are calling a lot of fouls off the ball because he was held and clobber, and so was Jordan and all those guys back then. But
Yep.
Reggie really moved well without the ball. And one of your things you talk in there, and I can't remember the exact, but I want to say was one of the games Clay had. He only took 4 dribbles but scored.
He's got these incredible, I can flip through here. I'm not exactly sure if I can just grab it, but Clay has these just absolutely unbelievable sort of, they're not even stats. Oh yeah, I got it here. On January 8th, 2009, Thompson scored 43 points against the New York Knicks. He only needed to take 4 dribbles to do so. So he scored 43 points on 4 dribbles. And then Thompson scored 60 points against the Pacers, your Pacers, in 2016. And his time of possession during that game was 90 seconds. So he had the ball for 90 seconds and he turned that into 60 points. And that's just sort of when you have a release like that and when you can come off screens and just detonate like that, I guess you could basically be a bystander for most of the game and still score 60. It's insane.
And Naismith would have loved that. Only 4 dribbles. I think would Clay be Naismith's favorite player right now?
That's a pretty interesting thought, and he'd be up there for sure.
So I had this down since we're on the Splash Brothers. You mentioned, and I'm jealous. I'm envious. You got to see Steph and Clay do a shooting workout, and you said in your book that you were slack-jawed at watching them. Like, what were you most in awe by?
I mean, just when you say automatic, it really is automatic. And you could, I mean, it's not just Steph and Clay. You go to shoot around before any NBA game, get there early, and just watch the 12th man on an NBA team who's going to be the best shooter you've ever seen in person in your entire life. And just to see them rise up, and when there's no one defending them, there's no pressure, these guys just don't miss. And then even when they do miss, you can see them immediately sort of make the adjustments and the corrections needed. So it's like watching these machine as flesh put a ball into a basket. It's even hard to comprehend. And again, to anyone listening, go to the next NBA game you get tickets to. Go early because the shoot around is worth the price of admission.
And Nick, you're not talking about the jelly roll line with about 15 minutes to go before the game. You're talking.
Nope, just guys working on their jumpers. Yeah, no jelly rolling. Although that's
So
that could be
you're
fun
talking about an
somewhere.
hour before the game, or whenever the gates open, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, as soon as early as they let you in, that's when you go, when they're actually working on. They're not self-consciously throwing it between their legs and stuff because they know the cameras are on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's what young kids see. Like they don't see the before they get out there. And I think you get high school kids, and we only get 20 minutes to warm up, and a lot of them want to do the finger roll
Yeah.
or the jelly roll they call it now. And I don't think they understand how much time they put in that hour before, where they're doing game shots, like you said, or correcting their mechanics, those kind of things. And the NBA gets a knock, and I think a lot of people think that they don't play hard or whatever. it People don't really realize these are the best players in the world, and like you
Best,
just said, they don't miss.
yes, and they're the best athletes in the world, and they are the biggest and fastest people you'd ever see, and they're also happen to be the most graceful. It's it's the kind of thing that it defies comprehension, and that's why I think seeing it in person really helps convey that, because you realize it's not just you know you got to try hard to get open. You got to try hard to at least get into your spot. So it's hard to comprehend for us mere mortals what an NBA player sort of approaches the game, which is also kind of a thing about the book where it's talked to a professional basketball player about all these things. Um, it might come a little more natural to them than to everyone else. So it's better to talk to astrophysicists. They have a more keen idea of just how hard everything is.
Talk to the astrophysicists. I believe that was the section when you talked about defense, right?
Yeah, that was sort of just about how good defense is invisible. It's when you're watching good team defense, it's actually kind of hard to see what it really sort of presents itself as is a lack or dearth of good offense. And so the astrophysicist was interesting. He was this guy who works at Oak Hill in Tennessee, and he's a brilliant genius. And he his job is basically to see the invisible. He looks out, it looks at data and looks at information coming in from these huge telescopes we have and sort of tries to visualize the furthest reaches of outer space. And I talked to him about what good team defense looks like to him, and he said it looks like a iridescent turtle shell with all these convexive shapes, and you see sort of these cells of players working in unison, pushing players out to the perimeter. And I thought that was just kind of beautiful and fascinating. That he's exactly the kind of guy who would be able to visualize what good team defense looks like.
That's awesome. And my coaching buddies out here are going to if you look at practice plans all around the world with basketball coaching, they're going to have what's called the shell defense. So you shell your defense or you shell their offense, and you don't want to, you don't want that offense to crack into that shell there. So I really connected with that chapter and him saying that, because that's kind of what we tell our kids. Hey, don't let them crack this shell. Like, this is it right here. Now, push them out away.
And you think about defense, people for the longest time would say, well, sign of a good defender is getting a lot of blocks, or they're getting a lot of, block shots. And there's also the sort of other side of that coin, which is, well, they shouldn't be in a position to be that close to the hoop anyway. If you're a block is a very much the sort of course of last resort. It's much better to have them jacking up contested long range shots and then getting to a point where they can eat where your guy can rotate over and block them. So it's one of those things. Again, the defense is it's hard to see. It's hard to visualize and hard to sort of truly understand. I think, as I say that as a fan, when I'm watching, it's sometimes it helps to be told when a team's playing good defense, because it's something that can easily go missed.
Right, and I think sometimes that gets lost in the color commentary, and that's where I think,
For sure.
when you have guys that have been coaches, I think you do get that, there's things to be said for players as well, but I think coaching some of the best color commentators I think have been coaches, and they kind of educate you there on just what's going on, and I think that makes you a more informed fan.
I could listen to Hubie Brown talk about defending the pick and roll for 100 years. He's great.
One of my first coaching DVDs was Hubie Brown. I heard him at a clinic. I still have the notes. Phenomenal. Yeah, he was great listening to. I'm going to tell you my favorite part of the book from a coach and a fan that I think will really take basketball to the next level. And I want to talk about the Elam ending. And I would really love to see this at all levels of play. And if you could, for our listeners, kind of just give them a little background about what the Elam ending is and how they kind of came about it. And I just think the thing I hate most about basketball is the last 2 or 3 minutes, and it's just foul, 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 and then it's just a free throw shooting contest from there.
Yeah, so Nick Elam is he's a professor at Ball State, and he is a professor in teaching. But when he was, I think, in grad school, I talked to him for a while for the book. He was watching a college game, and it was a kind of game that we've all seen before. It was exciting for the first 90% of the game, and then one team was behind and started to foul, and the game just ground to a halt. And it slowly you had this back and forth exciting affair kind of trickle to a slow and anticlimactic ending. And so his idea was, rather than have you play to the end of the clock. In the fourth quarter, the clock shuts off, and there's a target score, which is you take the average score of the different quarters, and then you kind of tack it on the end there, and then the first team to hit that target score wins the game. It solves a lot of problems. For example, intentional fouling. You're never going to intentionally put someone on the line because it's going to just let them creep up and have free shots at that target score, because you're not fighting against the clock anymore. You're basically only going for scoring. And it's something that he basically just sent a ton of emails to everyone he could. It finally got implemented in, I believe it was TBT, a kind of a semi-pro televised league. NBA players who were involved with that league, Chris Paul namely, thought this ending is so much more exciting. Every game has a game-winning basket. It ratchets up the defense, because you know these players can basically, they can see the target score in their head, and it kind of shifts the perspective of their motivations. And it's been used in the last 2 or 3 NBA All-Star games. And I don't know if you've watched those games, but NBA All-Star games, which are renowned and famous for the lack of defense being played. The second that fourth quarter comes, you have these guys diving on the floor, getting each other's faces, playing every single possession like it's the most important possession in the world, because the Elam ending sort of just fosters this increased sense of competition. And I think it's a brilliant and clever invention. And talking to Nick Elam about it, and he was basically someone who just had a good idea and has not stopped pursuing it until he saw it implemented in as many places as possible. So it's kind of an amazing story for him.
Well, hey, once again, I'm proud of my home state. Ball State is an Indiana school, so
Yeah, for sure.
I really think that would just put some excitement back, and keep people in the stands. How many times do you see people leave early?
You're exactly right, because everyone wants to see a game-winning shot. And it's one of those things that's a little difficult to explain, but once you see it in practice, it makes sense immediately. So there's good YouTube videos out there. Click Elam ending and kind of watch, and you'll realize sort of how sensible it is. And his thinking was so logical, which is that in the beginning, when Naismith invented the game, players were so bad and scoring was so infrequent that you needed a clock, because if you said, okay, play till 10, guys would be out there all night trying to score. But as the game evolved, players got so good that you don't, the clock is, you don't really need that anymore. Like the scoring can kind of drive the game action. So yeah, it's a fascinating ending, and I agree. I'm as much of a, I guess I'm not a purist, but as much as a purist as I might be compared to others, I still think Elam ending instituted today and the game improves.
100%. And I liked how you talked about how basketball, is part of that, where there's a time, and there's a few sports that aren't time bound. My daughter is a volleyball player, so I have fell in love with the sport of volleyball just through watching her play, and I think it's a fast-paced game, and I think there's a lot of action, and I think it's an ultimate team game. But we would almost have the best of both worlds, so to speak, if you have your time game, but then roughly 4 minutes left on the clock, then it becomes not time bound, but it's going to go down to the last shot.
Exactly, yeah. It's sort of this hybrid sport, and goes to show the sort of, representative of the evolution of the game. And as you said, volleyball has, you don't need a clock in volleyball. I think you need a clock for most of basketball, which is what Elam kind of his thesis there. But then at the end, when it's winning time, take the clock off, put the target score, and see what happens. And it's usually pretty dynamic.
And everybody loves a walk-off hit or home run in baseball. People love the last-second shot in basketball. And think about that in all these college and high school, the crowd just going, there, yes, and they're jumping up and down, and the excitement that also would foster for the fans.
Yes, and so and the one of the main complaints about the Elam ending is that, well, the game can be won on a foul shot, which may sound boring, but at the All-Star game, the first use of the Elam ending, I think it was Anthony Davis was at the line, and his team needed 1 point to win, and he missed the first one. So then the energy in the arena just ratcheted up exponentially for the second free throw. Usually in the fourth quarter, if they're shooting free throws, and it could be a, uh, you know, kind of hack a Shack moment. Everyone's thinking, "Oh God, he's going to the line. Gotta go sit through this." But this was a moment where everyone was at the edge of their seats, and this free throw all of a sudden became the most important free throw of the night. And when he made it, it kind of, the reaction was pretty thrilling too. I mean, it's a genius and brilliant fix for a problem that a lot of people, I'm sure, uh, assumed was unsolvable.
I mean, we like to see in golf the guys drive it really far, but at the end, it's usually what you're looking on the green at the putt to see who wins. What's different than that in a free throw?
Exactly, yeah. Tension's up. A 5 foot putt's not the easiest thing in the world.
No, no, it is not. It is not, and but you would still get those goosebumps when Tiger Woods was putting, for the green jacket. I mean, same thing. If you see your Jordans at the free throw line, that excitement's still going to be there,
Yep.
and maybe
Time
even
stops.
time stops. And that gets me to the last thing I want to talk about. You talked about slow motion, the I guess the technology of slow motion TV replay and everything. It was just almost like a perfect alignment. It came in right when the airness, Michael Jordan, kind of came into play, and actually, Michael's greatest stuff were mid '80s, late '80s, before like his really team basketball stuff was great in the '90s, his will to win, but like the freaky stuff, like the dunks and stuff like that,
Hmm.
were in the mid to late '80s.
Yeah, and he's so athletic and graceful that they really did need to slow down footage to fully comprehend what he was doing. Oh, he's switching hands, he's going left to right here, he's floating between this guy's outstretched arm, this other defender's. But that really was, as you said, a perfect storm in that the technology wasn't there for a while. Slow motion technology for replay didn't fully sort of become a fully realized and useful technology until the 80s, really, right when he was coming onto the scene. And it kind of, you know, slam dunk contests were the first sort of big events to really use technology to its fullest capabilities. And she basically, have this guy who suddenly starts turning parts of the game into an art form. And guys have been doing that forever, but it was harder for fans to sort of realize it. And you'd get in arena slow motions, and everyone knows now sort of that since there's the effect of the rippling waves of fans in the arena watching a jumbotron after amazing plays happen because they're showing slow motion replays, and it is because slow motion accentuates feelings of awe. I talked to researchers and professors about this, and it's one of the easiest sort of hacks and tricks to make something look awe-inspiring is to slow it down. And so, as luck would have it, you have the most awe-inspiring player in history come to the fore, just as the technology to increase that sensation of awe was also coming to the fore. So it was a perfect storm, and it all slowed down for Mike.
70s or the early 80s, you had David Thompson and Dr. J and some of they could, and Michael wasn't just, I think and to me, I think he's the greatest dunker, up there with Dominique Wilkins, but is it because of the slow motion that I get that all? Because Dr. J and David Thompson could really ram it home.
Oh, totally. And Jordan always talks about David Thompson being his main guy when it came to dunking. I mean, obviously Dr. J's, but I think it's more of just the for fans, it just became a feast where every game you turn
Yes.
on, you're gonna get some incredible sequence and incredible replay that you've never seen before. And gosh, if I think Dr. J at the tail end of his career was getting some good slow mo. The famous behind the backboard
Oh,
shot,
yeah.
which I actually don't know if they had that specific slow-mo angle ready at the time. That's a good question that I have to look into because time-wise, it might have been one of those things that came on a increased delay. Um, but yeah, there's it's the technology again of watching the sport rather than playing the sport gives us all these memories and whatnot.
And that's what's so special about this sport, I think, more than anything, is we do have a lot of these highlights that we can kind of go back, whether it's the pace of the game or whatever. I just think that there's so much with the technology of TV, and if there's ever been anything, with basketball and just being able to create the highlights, whether it's the N1 mixtape or whatever, basketball seems to be the sport that is best with the highlights. And I'm like you
Yes.
still have to experience it live because the first time I saw LeBron, it looked like a loaded locomotive stopping on a dime.
Oh yeah.
And making a pass. And believe me, LeBron broke my heart plenty of times being a Pacer fan, but I appreciate his level of skill. And it just,
Well, you have a guy who's built like Karl Malone playing like John Stockton.
yeah, that's a great comparison. Absolutely. And so there's a couple stories in the book that I kind of want, and I just chuckle at. One of them, and I remember watching his teams play at DePaul, was Ray Meyer. And this is for all the coaches out there, because you said George Mikan was athletic, but he wasn't always this athletic, was he?
No, yeah, he was kind of a klutz. And Ray Meyer at DePaul had him focus on dancing, get his footwork better. He kind of took this raw product and said, "Okay, let's get you, doing some box steps. You're gonna keep your feet, stop them from getting tangled," and sort of nurtured this awkward guy into what would become, grace can be taught. So that's one example.
So, guys, if you have a big time a player out there, a taller guy that needs help with footwork, and I believe Ray said find a smaller girl, which it wasn't hard for him to do when you're taller, but then the movement so that he wouldn't step on her feet.
Yep. He got to learn to dance, and that'll pave the way.
You talked to I think a screenwriter, and it was on the topic of flopping, and I think it was All My Children.
A casting director
Okay.
for soap operas, a casting agent for soap operas. Yeah.
So, and I still want to, listen, I want you all to buy this book. This is one of the best reads I've had in a long time. But can you tell them what the casting director said when they were watching you showed us some clips of the flopping, right?
Yeah, no, and she was funny. She said, well, you can't go overboard, but you still got to do enough that the referee notices you. So, like any good soap opera, you're going to have to learn to cry if you want to get a spot on the cast. But don't overdo it.
Don't overdo it. All right. So, hey, there's more great stories in there like that. There's, like you said, check the book out, How to Watch Basketball Like a Genius. The author is Nick Greene. Please check it out. I'm going to, in the show description, I'm going to put a link there to his website. I found it in our local bookstore here in Indianapolis.
Great.
You can go on Amazon, but hey, check it out. It is absolutely, if you love basketball, you just love talking about it. Even if you don't, there's enough in there for everybody. It's just an outstanding read. Nick, I want to thank you for taking time.
It was fun, and I really appreciate it. Thanks for reaching out.
You're welcome. And that concludes episode 4 of the Basketball and Bourbon podcast. And as we like to say on the show, cheers to the round ball and the barrel.